From the Gulf States newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm public health reporter Drew Hawkins, chopping it up this week. In the southwest corner of Louisiana, there's this massive build-out of liquified natural gas export terminals that's underway. The LNG industry says it's creating jobs and strengthening America's energy dominance. And this isn't exactly a new thing. And over the last decade or so, the LNG export industry has been growing. And the Gulf Coast, places like Cameron, Louisiana, it's really the epicenter of where it's all happening. With a documentary team from More Perfect Union, we talked to energy experts, community advocates, and we went down to Cameron to talk to fishermen about how the multi-billion-dollar industry is impacting them and the utility bills of Americans across the country, and how it's reshaped the landscape, the economy, and the daily lives of the people who have lived here for generations. Philip Dyson once tried working a job that wasn't shrimping. He lasted 3 days on an oil rig.
And the man said, all you got to do is tell me you want the job. We'll fire the other guys. And don't fire that man because I ain't coming back.
Dyson has fished the coastal waters of Cameron, Louisiana for more than 50 years. When he looks out from the shrimp dock now, he sees a landscape he doesn't recognize. Towering cranes, industrial tanks, and the constant hum of liquefied natural gas terminals running day and night. Cameron was once one of the top seafood ports in the country. Today, shrimpers like Dyson are catching less than half of what they used to.
There used to be 200 shrimp boats in this town. Now there's 15. You went from a fishing town to a town that care less about the fish.
Dyson is stubborn and set in his ways. Shrimping is all he knows. He doesn't want to leave Cameron. He buried his parents here, scattered his daughter's ashes in the water.
I would never want to leave her behind, but I'm going to have to.
The Gulf Coast is ground zero for America's LNG export boom. But what's happening here in Cameron isn't just impacting shrimpers. It's affecting the utility bills of Americans across the country.
It's simple supply and demand.
Tyson Slocum is an energy analyst with Public Citizen. He says when LNG supply surged, fueled by the fracking boom in the late 2000s, companies needed new buyers, and they looked overseas.
And that pushes the price, the domestic price of natural gas up. And the more we export, the higher the prices the rest of Americans will pay to heat and cool their homes.
8 LNG export terminals now consume more natural gas each day than all American households connected to gas service combined. The federal government projects prices will rise 22% on average in 2026, citing LNG exports as a factor.
Because natural gas represents about 40% of the fuel that produces electric power in the United States, the impact on electric utility bills has also been profound.
One of the biggest players here in Cameron is Venture Global. It operates the Calcasieu Pass terminal just outside town. 2 months after taking office, the Trump administration approved a second Venture Global terminal in Cameron. This rush to build multi-billion-dollar facilities has already led to mistakes. Last summer, a Venture Global dredge spill spat hundreds of acres of sediment into the surrounding marsh. Tad Terrio, who had already pivoted from shrimping to oyster farming because of falling catches, says the dredge spill devastated his oyster operation.
Half of them died. We lost, 50%. On the big ones, even more than that.
Out on the water, the evidence is plain.
But watch this.
Terrio opens up some oysters he pulled out of the water. They all had what he called mud blisters, deposits of silt visible inside the shell.
When you see that on that plate, are you going to eat it,
In a statement, Venture Global said the discharge was quickly contained and that there were no significant impacts. But Louisiana wildlife officials documented increased oyster mortality near the site. And according to documents obtained by More Perfect Union, some fishermen were offered $20,000 on the condition they never sue or speak negatively about the company. Terrio says that wouldn't even begin to cover his losses.
I have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of oysters. I want hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Still, the build-out continues. Across the country, more than a dozen LNG export terminals are under construction or approved, 6 of them in southwest Louisiana. You're listening to the Gulf States Gumbo. I'm Drew Hawkins. So you've just heard the story about how the LNG industry is driving up utility rates for Americans and driving out fishermen along the Gulf Coast. And that was all part of a documentary I did with More Perfect Union, which is out now, and you should all definitely go watch it on YouTube or social media. It's called Why Louisiana Fishermen Are at a Breaking Point. Now, there's a lot more included in the documentary. And to talk more about it, I'm here with the producer from More Perfect Union who orchestrated and coordinated the project, Paul Blest. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Drew. Thanks for having me.
So I really want to start at the end here with my questions because I'm really curious and I just want to know, how has the documentary been received? What sort of response have you seen since it came out last week?
So the story has gotten a really positive response from the fishermen and other folks living on the Gulf who are seeing the LNG build out dramatically change their surroundings. But a lot of people, unless they live near it or they're involved in the industry in some way, just don't really know that this is happening. So a lot of the response has been, shock and criticism of the corporations that are doing the build out without much regard for the people living there and the politicians who've allowed it to happen.
That's interesting. I'm curious about what you hope people might take away from this documentary. And like you mentioned, I'm thinking about people who live on the coast, but also people who across the country who may have never really even heard of LNG before this.
What I'm hoping people take away from this documentary that we did is that the LNG build out is impacting millions of Americans, both people in the Gulf and everyone who pays a gas or electric bill, because natural gas is so integral to the electrical grid in a lot of places around the country. But this model of LNG exports is really predicated on driving up natural gas prices here. And I think it's also worth it for people to know that the state government in Louisiana has fully encouraged this, even at the cost of the livelihoods of people who are, pretty dedicated Republican voters. And so this is really a case of an industry that's being prioritized over people.
Right. And, I mentioned that the LNG industry has been growing here in the Gulf South over the last decade, but you're not actually from here. So I'm curious to know about your backstory to this story, right? Like, how did you come across this and why did you want to make a full documentary about it?
Yeah, so energy prices have been a big part of our coverage over the past year or so, particularly with regard to data centers and how those are hiking electricity bills. But Tyson Slocum, who's one of the folks that we interviewed in the video, he's from Public Citizen, put out a report in November showing the impact of LNG exports on American families' energy bills. And through that conversation, we started learning more about the impact on fishermen in the places where these terminals were being built, namely Cameron Parish. And also just seeing, the Trump administration, the federal government itself has said that increased LNG exports are going to drive up natural gas prices. So this is just a given fact. Commodities traders understand it as a given fact. The companies themselves understand it. But the way that it's represented to the public is not exactly that. And so we thought it was right in line with our coverage on electricity prices and energy bills.
That's really interesting. Kind of starts on this top level, right? Large report, federal government decisions and views and stances on it. And then you sort of honed it down to that community impact level. Right. And I alluded to this earlier about you being sort of like a master of puppets behind the scenes here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it took to make this documentary happen.
So we were lucky enough to get in touch with a number of fishermen and advocates who were willing to spend time with us and talk with us about what they were dealing with. When we produced this documentary, a major winter storm was happening, and
I
so
remember.
yeah, people were willing to still give us the time of day, even though they were dealing with that. We wouldn't have been able to do this story without them and their honest assessment of how they were being impacted by this.
Yeah, we had that winter storm. There were several hiccups that sort of happened along the way, right? We had people cancel on us while we were already out there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges of reporting and creating this documentary.
From before we even got to Louisiana, finding folks who were willing to go on camera. This story has been covered before in the past. This build has been happening for about a decade now, and so I think one of the challenges was showing to the people that we were talking to that this wasn't just going to be like sort of a do the story and get out of their situation. We really wanted to get their input on what was happening. And so, yeah, I think that, some of the challenges were obviously dealing with the storm. getting the access that we needed. But, we were able to, the fishermen and people who are living nearby were willing to spend the time with us.
Tad Terrio, he's heavily featured in the documentary. I know he called you. He called me after it came out, said he was really happy with it. And one of the things that he said was that he actually didn't know about sort of the connection at at their level of LNG when they live right next to these export terminals, how that is connected to larger energy policy and the federal government, really, and President Trump's priorities. I think that felt good to have people who are living with the impacts of it say that, oh, I actually didn't even know about these connections that you guys found here as well. And, speaking of Trump and the federal government, since this documentary came out, I guess you could say a few things have changed. For example, we're now at war with Iran.
And you've also covered how the Iran war is already affecting LNG since the doc came out too, right?
I have, yeah. I called up Tyson Slocum from Public Citizen, who's, a big voice in this documentary project. He told me that the Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz, sent these shockwaves through natural gas markets in Europe and Asia. But, the thing is, while natural gas prices have increased sharply in Europe and Asia so far, they haven't done that in the U.S. because, a lot of oil and gas experts say that this country may be largely protected from natural gas spikes this year because the companies are already exporting about as much as they can, right? They're at capacity, pushing out more than 14 billion cubic feet of natural gas a day. So the U.S. would really need to build additional LNG terminals. And Slocum says the war in Iran could push the U.S. industry to try to export more.
Yeah, and right after the airstrike started, Venture Global CEO was asked in an investor call what the impact of the war would be on prices in his business. His response was basically, we're playing a long game, but he said, quote, in the short term, higher prices are helpful for our spreads. So the industry in the U.S. stands to make a lot of money as a result of this war.
Paul Blest is a producer at More Perfect Union. Thank you so much for joining me and talking about this documentary, Paul.
Thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me.
Wait, Paul, before you go, we have a little segment here at the end of the show called Gulf States Gems. And the idea is that we have this chance to shout out something that we love about the region. So it could be a restaurant, a landmark, famous person, famous thing, whatever you think of. And I know that you have spent a fair amount of time now in the Gulf South. So I want to know, what would your Gulf States gem be?
So when we went to Southwest Louisiana for this story, I realized that Lucinda Williams was from Southwest Louisiana, Lake Charles specifically. So I've been listening to a lot of Lucinda Williams recently. Car Wheels on a gravel road. So yeah, that's gotten me hooked again on her stuff. Just being in the proximity to where she grew up.
A little bit of method reporting there, like really embodying the spirit, right?
Exactly.
That's great. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, for sure.
This week's show is cooked up by the Gulf States Newsroom team. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations, WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find us in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Again, I'm your host, Drew Hawkins. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to stir your room.